Hey guys, here to get into one of my all-time favorite bands of the '90s, Soundgarden. They're my favorite grunge band of the Big Four. Yes, Nirvana is so stinking close, but I think Soundgarden has the best sound ultimately when they're at their best. So particularly from the album Super Unknown, and Bad Motor Figure is amazing as well as a lot of other stuff scattered in between. A lot of the stuff's pretty awesome in the end. They're just a very original kind of band all around. One that had certainly the most complex sound that certainly does kind of bridge the feeling of a band like Nirvana and a band like Tool. And I can almost see like Tool is almost so cold I can't quite grasp its place, but it feels like Nirvana is almost just wearing its heart on the sleeve so intensely that it's just raw burnout. So Soundgarden is just like a band that's on raw burnout, and they're feeling very technically complex in the instrumentals. And I think there's a feeling here of spirit that's just very timeless ultimately. And much like Nirvana, I think I spent a lot of my youth studying the lyrics of Soundgarden. Like 2007, the year particularly was the year I discovered Soundgarden, as well as I was getting to a lot of bands. And this is one of the perhaps low key the most particular one that taught me the spirit of rock and roll in a lot of ways. I remember going out to the beach and spending weeks just being obsessed with this band. I mean, at the time there was bands like Red Hot Chili Peppers coming into play too, but now I'm like, I see the naivete in on that band. Soundgarden, I think, is the true essence of that. And sort of that maybe where you're feeling angsty, but you're stupid if you get too out about it. But Soundgarden knows how to just make it like over the top feeling, not ridiculous. That's the thing about them that makes it spark ultimately. But to get into their albums, we got in 1988. Ultra Mega OK. And yeah, I mean, I think when you stack this next to the albums to come, this really is just a pretty shallow experience, honestly, because it's only mildly satisfying in brief moments, but it really just doesn't have that much lasting power next to how epic everything is to come, basically. And that's the thing about Soundgarden. I think they capture a unique scope of epic. And I think this is certainly one that doesn't really have an epic energy living inside of it, but it's not that entertaining to listen to either. I mean, most of these songs just don't really stand out much alone whatsoever. You're just listening to it simply to hear this beautiful sound in motion, basically. The very early roots of it. And, the first half of it has moments where it's like, okay, that's a pretty cool sound going on here. And it feels kind of grungy, but it ultimately ends up just being something that just feels like kind of like a sound that feels like a bit of dated heavy metal with a gothic undertone. And there is a dated into that feeling I've come to see in time. That's a lot of what's going on here. Some of just now the harmonies aren't that great, and there's just a wave of energy that's just not really strong here. It just feels like it's kind of, not the strong spirited really, and the lyrics aren't that depressing really. But I think that the style here is pretty. Like you hear a style blooming, which gets further with the album "Louder Than Love" in 1989, which is a really good album. Not a great one, but it's a really good one. And it feels like it's a little bit weird in its own kind of way. Where I think what Soundgarden needed to do is truly incorporate some psychedelia into their sound. I think they weren't being honest yet about how psychedelic they ultimately are, which is a very relatable place. Like sometimes you don't want to admit that because when you see the madness and the dark side of it, it's like you almost don't want to run around admitting that, but you have to kind of admit it. That's what's going to come out. I guess that grounded maximalism, you could say. But it's like this is a band that definitely isn't like minimal whatsoever. This is certainly, some maximalism. This is my favorite shade of one of my favorite shades of maximalism. Next to, all the other stuff like Joy and Newsom. Like, but this is a very different shape from Joy and Newsom. This is the masculine rawness. And the depression is real here as it comes to turn out, unfortunately. But while living it in the moment of height within the joy of depression, which is seems like all the best grunge stars, ended up with suicide for a reason. So it's like, wow, that certainly is a cautionary tale living here. And limits in a lot of ways. That's why I see a lot of modern musicians that save a lot of this in 2010s. The best of that's literally like a saving grace of, what this kind of ends up, killing in the end, which is like that myth of a rock star. Because literally, like too dark for a person to handle. I mean, this also feels like a little bit of Pink Floyd inspiration too, kind of continuing, almost getting directly to the madness of Sibyl rather than studying it from a psychological way. This isn't a very the lyrics are just very poetic, honestly. It feels like it's its own thing entirely. I mean, Chris Cornell just almost writes in the way like the Beatles would write a song, very heartfelt, but expressed in a completely different, 100% different way from the Beatles. It's just raw rock and roll, very grungy, you could say, like definitely the feeling of the early 90s and blooming right here, but that really takes off in the year 1991 when we get Bad Motor Figure. And this is just a really great album entirely. I mean, there's like a few moments that are a little bit filler, but I ultimately love the drift of this album so much. So it is a personal favorite. There's just a lot of great, like they are just masters of the verse, refrain, verse set, just like a forward foundation of Black Sabbath, honestly. And I prefer. There's a few bands I do prefer over Black Sabbath. It's like what bands in the '90s were doing. I think they further evolved it, like this band did at Caius, because it's a little bit more of a Velvet Underground feeling of just doing it and letting loose with atmosphere, not rather than and slow and pacing. Rather than being concerned with perfect instrumentation, you're more concerned with just a pacing structure and creating a sonic cinematic feeling. You could say a lot of these songs really do feel quite cinematic. Like I really like the song "Somewhere." I mean, that one really just has this kind of interesting drift to it, with a lot of interesting narration behind it. Room 1,000 Years Wide is one of my all-time favorite songs. So that is just a song of madness and literally just going into an endless canvas of the imagination to a really wild kind of way and expressing the rawness, the joyness, and I think I come to realize in time some of this is like almost this expression of an I don't care attitude in a lot of ways. I never, when I was younger, I think I truly wasn't seeing that. So this is like, a lot of the '90s, I was truly naive to what was actually going on in the '90s, and now looking back on it, it's like, oh, okay. Holy water. I mean, New Damage. Those are probably the least interesting songs on the album. They're the closers of the album. I think there's just a slight drag. That's what makes the album perfect. The last bit does drag a little, but still, it's pretty awesome to listen to this all the same. And all these songs just range with quite excellence. I really love the songs like Face Pollution. That's really powerful and raw. So is Drawing Flies. Like, it just rock really hard. I feel very original in how much they groove. I can really listen to those songs quite endlessly because they just get all the way in, just raw. And just feeling cool with it being raw. And I love the slow-paced songs like Searching with My Good Eye Closed and Slaves and Bulldozers. Those are very epic, very completely different. It's just like removed from anything else going on in alternative rock. Like, I mean, this takes like stuff like REM was doing, something so different. Hey, this is just heavy, just getting intense. It feels like all these songs are very nocturnal and just focused on atmosphere and mystery. Again, it's like the Black Sabbath thing where it's like, this could be ridiculous, but you could take it seriously because it's just the focus on the mood and atmosphere is very intense. It's like watching a film, like the feeling of watching a great film, and the coolness of the riffs living inside of here. You got something like Mind Riot. That's just a really light one. I really enjoyed that one a lot, and the way that the guitars just give this beautiful melody the entire way through. It's very underrated. I love like the opening songs like Rusty Cage and Outshine. I have so many fond memories of just being on the lake, just listening to this. Oh man, I'm gonna be doing that a lot this summer. I can't wait. I'm filming this movie, and just letting this light moment guide the dark moments, and all the way through. Creating something beautiful. I love the whole spectrum of it. It's a beautiful ride. Soundgarden captures why just being out in the desert and listening is always cool. Jesus Christ Pose. That's one of the best songs ever made as far as just sounding very fast paced. It's like something menacing is living inside of it, but it ultimately is very powerful song about the God complex and ultimately how it is better to limit it to a greater good of Jesus Christ. Not just like letting yourself ever get carried away with the delusion of a person thinking that they are this like greater force. It's better to like limit yourself to something of a greater force in the end. And I don't have to define that, how you do that, but in the end it's like just something, because when you have that something, it literally benefits your life in a certain way. It does. The lonely man especially needs that. I feel like every person needs that. In their own kind of way. But this is perfect right here. I mean, Soundgarden is just a really happy band in the way that they invite you to all this. And then you get the best material right here in 1994, which is super unknown. This is my favorite, perhaps one of the best albums ever made to come out in the 90s. Probably the most important one to me. And there's maybe like one or two songs that are slightly filler, but honestly, the experience of listening to this is perfect to me. It's almost like I feel like it betters a lot of what Smashing Pumpkins is doing, honestly, because this is different than Bad Motorfinger. This is a lot more slow paced, a lot more. Again, it's like listening to movies, literally. And it's like an epic. I mean, this is like 75 minutes long. And about every single moment of this is just layered, deeply full of classics. It just feels like the best music that possibly came out of the grunge movement. It feels like the closure of like classic grunge, along with Nirvana's MTV Unplugged. It feels like they're kind of like literally like Soundgarden. Of course, Chris Cornell didn't really get to these depths until like the late 2010s, but it's a very haunting place right here for sure. Certainly, I mean, this is the thing. I love this even more than all Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Alice in Chains. Smashing Pumpkins, much as great as those are, because this is just feels like this almost sounds like a nightmare being captured, and it just captures it with perfect musicianship. Very complicated soundscapes that do remind me a lot of what Tool's doing, but in a more heartfelt way. That's the thing about this album. It just feels like psychedelic. It's like a 90s psychedelia, the summation of 90s psychedelia. This is probably the epitome probably the album I would suggest to anyone who's looking for what this sounds like. Now his guitar solos are just so perfect at capturing just something that really is just beyond it's beautiful, and it's just so better than some of its places because the big hits are all here. I mean, but like Black Hole Sun. But my favorite stuff is stuff like the 4th of July, which is just so sludgy and it just sounds like horrific sounds, and it really foreshadows a lot of what's going on in Kid A. Honestly, the way it sounds, very slow paced, very moody, menacing. Mood is the ultimate key here. While My Wave, it's one of the catchiest songs I've ever heard in my life. I just have so many fond memories of just running to a lot of this music. This music certainly is my running, attitude. Yeah, this song just lives in your head forever. Just makes you want to drift in it forever. I drift in a nice headspace. While Head Down is just like a nightmare of psychedelia, which is just concerned with just riffs that ultimately sound like stoner riffs, but with a more heartfelt kind of way, with guitars that just sound like a bunch of sitar influences going into it. It just really has a lot of high-pitched vocals going on from Chris Cornell. And that's the thing. He's much like how Neil Young is, and just no one sings like him. It's completely unique entirely. The self-titled track, Super Unknown, is one of my favorite rockers all the time. And so is like the opening song, Let Me Drown, which just simply kicked my butt the entire way through. That's the best thing about it. And all this, it just sounds like sludge metal. You got like Mailman, Limbo Wreck. Limbo Wreck's one of my favorites. My favorite song on the album is The Closer, Like Suicide, which is the first song I ever studied the lyrics to and actually felt the goosebumps and felt like I'd been possessed by something. And that's the way a lot of the best music feels, like you're being possessed in a certain kind of way. And Soundgarden certainly possesses you with this and Bad Motor Finger. All these songs. There's just nothing quite like what's going on here. This just simply is the early 90s in a nutshell. I mean, this is perfect, honestly. And it really does kind of portray a lot of just darkness. You could almost just say like songs like, again, Black Hole Sun just really feels like evil psychedelia. So it's like Head Down. Spoon Man has like some of the weirdest drumming. The quirky drumming is really what gets me here. The riffs, like Day I Try to Live, just sounds really quirky. So one of my all-time favorite songs in Depression they did is Fell on Black Days, because that just really portrays just phenomenal sitar work. It's just really catchy the entire way through it. Like, I think that's the particular song I have memories of drifting to, because I always feel like the third song on the album can be quite distinctive, and I feel like this is an example of just a song tapping into the notion of depression in a very unique kind of way, and it's really quite great. Now, one of my all-time favorite sounds. It really is. Like this is the epitome of the grunge '90s. I feel like the early '90s, before the late '90s kind of came around, and like, okay, like literally suicide's coming here. This is getting too serious. So this is like a limit right here of classic rock and roll soundscapes right here. There's a couple songs like I really love the mood of Fresh Tinderless. I know a lot of people see it as a filler, but I think there's just something really cool about that sound. Maybe the only filler moment could be Mailman. That one rambles a little, but I love like everything else going on here. I mean, this is like literally 67 minutes of just genius gold, honestly, in a very original kind of way, which further progresses Nirvana, basically. So I think a better drift ultimately, because I think this guy's just maybe Kurt Cobain almost had too much of an over-the-top idealism of stardom, in his early years, and that's what kind of brought him to his dark depths. And I think, it ultimately caught up to Chris Cornell, but all the Soundgarden, I think they just kind of were a little bit more just like laid back, like seeing how Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin were doing it, but bringing that energy entirely to grunge, which is very original. I prefer this sound ultimately than both of those bands. As much as I do love Led Zeppelin. I have to cover them. I got drained from them for like a decade, and I come back, and ultimately they do have a nice place, a really lovely place in my heart. I'll certainly have to cover them. I'm pretty tired of Pearl Jam, though. I don't hear them, and I really hear the magic of them as much. It's ironic because I know Eddie Vedder is the man who's the survivor of this. So he is a legendary man. The band themselves, they just I guess it's just I'm too fascinated by the darkness, and that's what is appealing about grunge. I certainly feel a lot of this influence coming out of me, in this directorial process, because this is very cinematic energy. As I read dissecting these lyrics, there's something just very cinematic going on this album. It sounds like a certain madness is unfolding. And it kind of sounds like they're just kind of bringing like this, laying out this loose experimentation, like the White Album, literally, like is kind of doing the '90s foundation of the White Album. So I think this ultimately sounds like, and yeah, a lot of Indian rock going on here. It's just so much extended guitar work that just makes this a genius album, best album they made by far. It's very unique, most successful album they made too. So this is like an album I feel like anyone can listen to and just love it. It's a special one. This has a place in my heart eternally. This is, the best album of grunge. This is like better than both the first two Nevermind In Utero. Like it's like a balance of those two in its own kind of way entirely. It's even better, I think, as much as I love those albums. And again, 1996 down on the upside, and it's definitely a lot less interesting as a whole. There's a lot of filler moments here, a lot of stuff that just rambles on really hard. Like they're just kind of just throwing out a lot of aimless rock that almost borders on like AC/DC, Guns N' Roses at times. So I'm just not feeling that, because they're much better whenever they have atmosphere and mood, like Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin. I think they just lose the charm here. It's like a little dated. But there's a couple of moments here that are as good as the Super Unknown moments, like about 3 or 4 songs that are masterpieces. Like Pretty Noose is particularly a genius one. That just continues the feeling and spirit of Super Unknown in its own kind of way. Blow Up the Outside World's like an original place of its own entirely. And I have so many fond memories of running, and letting this song particularly get me into the mood of a spirit of running. So is Burden in My Hand. Overall, though, yeah, too many songs are just getting on too long. There's not too much to say here. Then, yeah, they lay low until Chris Cornell had, really, I think, something of a bizarre kind of run with his solo career. Like, he released an album, I think it took off really popularly, but it was very critically panned. So then he ended up getting out with a band, and they laid out an all right sound in 2012, but definitely burnt out. You can hear it. But again, now I haven't really listened to this since Chris Cornell's passing. So this is, I imagine this could be a little bit of a different listening now. Maybe foreshadowing a little bit of what Bowie's doing with Black Star. But I don't know if Chris Cornell knew it at this time. Who knows? I think he really was just kind of at a place. But I think this album is just definitely interesting. And yeah, it's a sound that it's because it's very tired. So I might have to go back and re-listen to this sometime. But that's Soundgarden. Yeah, they're a pretty great, pretty amazing band. I think they're certainly one of the most gothic modern bands of all time, because this turns out to be even more gothic and haunting to me than Kurt Cobain. Because Kurt Cobain was loud about his depression, but Chris Cornell sounds like he's having a good time. He's almost literally a walking course of the nihilistic. It sounds like he knew how to hide it, and then demons could catch up and never leave you. So this is like an ultimate expression of just what that is. So it's the modern foundation of the gothic energy right there. For the, I think the late 90s, 2010s really had to clean a lot of this up, I think, for a reason. But this is, I think, a great sound, and that's very important as far as capturing what that moment was like, and that maybe taking the best of all that with all the instrumentation. I think they just inspire me a lot as far as just going out there with just weird instrumentation that ultimately ends up being for the better because it's original, and just going for it. That's the good side of all this. And that's, of course, the side that he'll always be remembered for. Because legendary of Chris Cornell. He's a legendary vocalist. No one in the planet sings. It reminds you of the Neil Young Foundation of, I can't say I've heard one man sing like this. It almost takes a little bit of influence of like good bands like Judas Priest. It's like, geez. Yeah, this sound here. Soundgarden. They're a very unique and original band. I highly recommend them to anybody, honestly. They're perfect.